Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Mike Lenz, Associate Professor of Urban Planning and Public Policy at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. Thank you for joining us for this wonderful book talk today featuring Professor Eva Rosen, author of The Voucher Promise, Section 8, and the Fate of an American Neighborhood. I want to thank Whitney Willis and Shane Phillips and others at the UCLA Lewis Center for organizing this talk. And I want to welcome our audience members, in particular from the California Center for Population Research in the Department of Sociology at UCLA. Dr. Rosen is an assistant professor at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. Eva received her PhD from Harvard University in sociology and social policy and did her postdoc at Johns Hopkins University. She's an urban sociologist who has published papers on crime and violence, poverty, housing and race in journals including the American Sociological Review, City and Community, Social Problems and Housing Policy Debate, and several others. In 2018, she was recognized as one of the Association for Public Policy Management's outstanding early career scholars and received the 40 for 40 fellowship. Rosen's work has been funded by many organizations. I'll name a couple. The National Science Foundation, I'm sure we've heard of that. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the Joint Center for Housing Studies, as well as the NYU Furman Center, in addition to others. The book that Dr. Rosen will be discussing today, The Voucher Promise, was published by Princeton University Press in July 2020. So we are getting today very fresh and cutting edge research, although I know this has been a labor of many years for Dr. Rosen. For those familiar with Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, one way that I would frame the contribution of Dr. Rosen's book is that it looks at a more generalized version of housing precarity than just eviction, which is by itself important, but a specific form of housing precarity. And Dr. Rosen's book focuses much more clearly on a specific policy to do something about housing precarity more generally. In this book, we learn heartbreaking stories of crushing poverty and inevitable conflicts between landlords and tenants. Of course, in the context of racialized housing markets, we also learn the strengths and limitations of the voucher program in reshaping these conflicts in housing policy's underfunded quest to make housing more affordable and attainable in more places. Before I turn it over to Dr. Rosen, just a bit of housekeeping. She and Eva will begin her discussion of her book for about 20 minutes. I will pose some questions to her after that for about 15 more, and then we will turn it over to the audience questions. Please post your questions for Dr. Rosen in the Q&A, and I will do my best to get to yours. Once we get going, I'll also post a 20% off voucher of sorts for those who wish to purchase this great book. I've read it cover to cover and I can very strongly endorse it. I think I have a blurb on the back, so I'm really serious about this. It's a great book. And so I'll post that in the press. And now finally, I turn it over to Dr. Eva Rosen.
Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you for all your support along the way and of course for your blurb. And thank you all for being here. I'm really excited. I wish, of course, I could be there in person, but this is a nice substitute and it looks like we have a nice turnout. So thanks to everyone for coming. So I'm going to talk to you today about this book that came out in July. It's called The Voucher Promise. And interesting. So Whitney, it looks like I can't actually advance my slides. I'm so sorry. Oh, there it is. Can you guys see that slide advancing? Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
So that you can. Okay, great. All right, so I apologize for this technology. So in the past 2 decades, as any of you all who study housing policy know, there's really been a huge transformation in American housing policy. And I study what this transformation looks like in one neighborhood and one city. So I study Baltimore, and I study a neighborhood where poor families have really moved in large numbers with housing vouchers. So in the 70s, under the Nixon administration, housing vouchers were created. They were thought to be really an economically efficient tool to use existing housing stock, private housing stock, to provide homes for the poor. And in the 90s, the program was expanded to house hundreds of thousands of people who were put out when public housing was torn down, as well as many others who needed housing assistance. As high-rises were demolished across the country, we really ushered in a new era of federal aid, and it's one that relies on the private market to, in theory, provide opportunities for poor families to move to new neighborhoods. But despite certain improvements over the years, the program has in many ways failed to do this. So the book that I'll tell you about today is what I call an ethnography of a policy. It explores housing vouchers, what they were originally meant to do, what policymakers have come to hope that they might be able to do, and then what they actually do and don't do. So when we think about the history of housing policy, we can think about three eras in which it has unfolded. And the first is the tenement slums of cities like New York and Chicago, where immigrants settled, and later Black migrants from the South during the Great Migration. In the 30s, urban renewal raised the slums and public housing was created. High-rises were built across the country intended to literally lift the poor out of poverty by providing safe, clean homes with modern amenities like running water and elevators. These are some of the original posters from the housing programs during that time. In the second era, buildings like Cabrini Green in Chicago, Lafayette Courts in Baltimore that you see here, they were meant to alleviate slum poverty, but they really ended up helping to concentrate it in neighborhoods that were racially segregated with high crime and really few resources. This is what Arnold Hirsch, of course, famously called the second ghetto, implicating federal housing policies as complicit in the perpetuation of racial segregation. Wilson's seminal work, The Truly Disadvantaged, documented macroeconomic changes that gave birth to a new urban underclass. So as manufacturing left the city, he showed, so too did the jobs in the middle class, creating a new sort of geographic and social isolation, more concentrated than ever before, with really profound effects for social networks, jobs, and educational attainment. And from redlining to racial covenants to separate and unequal public housing rosters, discrimination in housing practices really persisted throughout this era, even well after some were outlawed in the Fair Housing Act. These formal and informal practices played a pivotal role in sorting people across the urban landscape by race. Furthermore, several prominent lawsuits found that the location of public housing was contributing to racial segregation in violation of the Fair Housing Act. In the 90s, bolstered by these theories of concentrated poverty and social isolation, they set the stage for a huge overhaul of federal housing policy. And in the following years, we witnessed the dismantling of an entire system of housing the poor. The Secretary of HUD at the time proposed reforms that would, in his words, end public housing as we know it. And over the past 3 decades, blighted public housing has been downsized and demolished across the country. Of course, public housing still exists, but there's been a huge shift in how assistance is administered overall and also in what direction we're moving in. And in its wake, we're really entering a third housing regime, one where high-rise demolition and a transition to housing the poor in the private market have become cornerstones of the government's quest to fight concentrated poverty. So by the late 90s, vouchers became the largest housing assistance program in the country, serving 2.2 million households. And for those of you who may not know, what the voucher does is it subsidizes the cost of the unit in the private market. So families pay 30% of their income in rent. The government pays the rest directly to the landlord. Rent ceilings, payment standards are set around fair market rent in Baltimore. At the time I did this work, it was about $1,300 for a 2-bedroom. And anyone earning under a certain income threshold is eligible. But importantly, only 1 in 4 families who qualify actually receives any aid. And in fact, the waiting list in Baltimore is longer than the number of people who actually receive vouchers. It's so long that it is usually closed, so you can't actually even sign up for the waiting list. Nationwide, voucher holders are 35% white, 45% Black, but in Baltimore, 94% of voucher holders are Black. In 1998, the program was renamed the Housing Choice Voucher Program with this idea that The program should really put an emphasis on promoting geographic opportunity through choice. So vouchers are really hoped to create opportunities for poor families to move out of distressed neighborhoods, to move into homes of their choosing, neighborhoods that might be safer with better schools. But the big question, of course, is do they? And this isn't a question that I had to answer myself. There's lots of great research out there. When we look at where voucher holders end up, where they move to, we can see that there's some improvement, especially relative to the kinds of neighborhoods where assisted renters lived in public housing. So voucher holders today are somewhat less likely to live in neighborhoods of extreme poverty compared to those who don't receive any assistance at all. But by and large, they still live in poor neighborhoods, and they aren't really moving to areas that we might call areas of opportunity. In addition, there are really important racial differences. So voucher holders live in highly segregated neighborhoods, and minorities are half as likely as whites to make it to a low poverty neighborhood with their voucher. What these results can't tell us, though, is how people decide where to live, what role the voucher plays in this decision, and what constrains those choices. So some of the bigger questions that motivated this book were, where do poor people move and why? And of course, existing literature illuminates all kinds of preferences that people may have about where they live related to geography, race, social networks. But what I found is that we had more to learn about what choice actually looks like for voucher holders within this set of constraints. And I really wondered whether this underlying theory that moving near to higher income neighbors actually helps people, and how voucher holders were actually received by their new neighbors. More broadly, I wondered what we should actually expect that a market-based program would produce, whether we should actually expect that a market-based program would produce different outcomes than the broader housing market already does. So to look at this question, I did about 15 months of fieldwork in a neighborhood in Baltimore called Park Heights. And this map of Baltimore on the right shows where vouchers are used across the city. It's not adjusted for housing density, but you can see that each dot there represents 2 vouchers. Overall, Park Heights, the neighborhood that's outlined in red in the northwest, it has one of the highest voucher rates in the city, and actually Baltimore as a whole has one of the highest voucher rates of any US city. The average for the city is around 9% of occupied rental units. In Park Heights, it's as high as 17%. And so I moved into the neighborhood in 2007. I did fieldwork for about 15 months using a combination of ethnographic observations and in-depth interviews. What I did to start was I sampled addresses from the website where the Housing Authority directs all voucher holders to find homes. It's called gosection.com. And then I went door to door in the neighborhood to find folks. So I got to know residents, their friends and families, and I really focused on 4 different groups. So I started out by looking for voucher holders, and in the process, I ended up talking to a lot of unassisted renters because, of course, even though this is a neighborhood with a high concentration of voucher holders, there are far more people who don't receive assistance. I also talked to the aging homeowners who bought their homes in the 60s. And then finally, I ended up talking to a lot of the landlords who provide housing for renters in this neighborhood. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of the landscape of the neighborhood. This picture shows one of the main streets. It's lined with these big, spacious homes. But of course, many areas in the neighborhood are vacant. In some areas, there are more vacant homes than occupied ones. Park Heights has one of the highest vacancy rates in the city. You can see all the way over on the left that there is one home that looks occupied. It's got a bunch of flower pots on the front porch. And then the neighborhood is peppered with these gaping holes. Again, here on the left side, you can see this. There's a big tree popping up where there used to be a home, but it's been long since torn down. So just a very brief history of this neighborhood to give you a little bit of context. In 1969, this is the Park Heights that Terrence Green, who you see in this picture here with his wife, this is the Park Heights that he got to know when he bought a home in the late 60s. At that time, it was a tree-lined neighborhood where mostly white middle-class families lived. Due to a long history, though, of racial covenants and redlining, African American families in Baltimore, as in most cities in this country, were not allowed to move just anywhere. And in the 60s, for the first time, banks became willing to actually lend money to Black home buyers in neighborhoods like Park Heights. So back then, Mr. Green says, my goodness, Park Heights in 1960, when I bought this house, everybody in this whole area was white. There were no Black people, nowhere. In fact, the neighborhood was predominantly Jewish, which for Mr. Green was a selling point. He loved the deli around the corner. And he put what happened next in really simple terms. He said, let me explain it to you, sweetheart. In those days, anytime a Black person would buy a house, all the Jewish people would leave. So in the 60s, in a practice known as blockbusting, which many credit Baltimore for inventing, real estate agents stoked fears of Black incursion in Park Heights by flipping white-owned homes one at a time. And as Black families moved in, of course, white families moved out. Interestingly, though, Mr. Green doesn't harbor a ton of animosity towards the white families who left. He said they did what they felt they had to. You know, something, they weren't wrong. They knew things were changing because now we're all stuck with homes that ain't worth nothing. So in 1960, Park Heights was 95% white and primarily middle class, but in the span of just a decade, this community of 20,000 people was replaced almost entirely. So by 2010, as you can see now in the blue, it was 96% Black. Over the years, though, the neighborhood has been hard hit with economic troubles, joblessness, and aging housing stock. The entire city was hit with these problems, but it was hit a little bit worse in Park Heights. It now has one of the higher violent crime rates in the city. So I don't have time to get into all the findings with you today, but I want to highlight just a couple of the big pieces of the argument, and hopefully that will be enough to pique your interest. So let's see here. So on the one hand, vouchers are meant to provide stable housing, and research shows that they actually really do this quite well. The program improves housing affordability, it reduces homelessness, and alleviates overcrowding. This is really important to highlight, I think, in our current climate where all of our housing programs are really at risk. So in chapter 2, I tell the stories of the folks who don't receive any housing assistance. Mike talked about this a little bit, and it's quite clear how much worse off they are compared to the people who do receive assistance. In chapter 3, I tell the stories of several people who do receive a housing voucher and the ways in which it changed their lives. However, policymakers also hope that the program will provide choice, will get people to new neighborhoods, to achieve mobility, to move up in the world. And on this second point, the program is not doing as well as I showed you in some of the slides earlier where we look at the geographic results of where people actually end up. What I found, though, is that it does provide flexibility, especially compared to some of the earlier housing programs we had and still have, like public housing. So for all the program's faults, I don't think we should underestimate the importance of flexibility. This is something middle-class families take for granted, the idea that you can get up and move if you get a new job or if your kid is being bullied in school, the ability to actually make some sort of decision, even if that decision is within a significant set of constraints. Now, one of the most important chapters in the book helps to explain why folks aren't using their vouchers in the kinds of neighborhoods that policymakers might hope. And there's a couple of reasons why this is the case that have been well studied that I talked about earlier. But when I started this work, very few people were talking about the role of landlords. So we talk about social networks, we talk about preferences, but what about the constraints that landlords actually impose upon tenants themselves? So this chapter opens with an anecdote about a landlord named David who stands outside the voucher office to recruit voucher tenants. And because of the way rent ceilings are set, landlords in poorer neighborhoods like Park Heights, where David has a lot of properties, they really have an incentive to find voucher tenants. Voucher tenants' rent is both more reliable because the majority of it is paid directly by the housing authority, and it's also often higher. So landlords report that and there has been research on this too, that shows that landlords in the program in certain neighborhoods can actually get a premium above what the market would pay in that neighborhood otherwise. And this results in a sort of predatory inclusion, to borrow a term from Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, where voucher holders are really not making full choices about where they live. They're being pulled into neighborhoods on somewhat predatory and unequal terms. At the same time though, and this is something that of course I can't study directly in the book, focusing primarily on a more disadvantaged neighborhood, but have looked at in a broader study on landlords that I have. At the same time as you have this predatory inclusion, the other side of the coin is that you see exclusion by landlords in more affluent neighborhoods. So some landlords are outright racist, others worry that their tenants are and don't, that their other tenants are right, and so they don't want to allow voucher holders, and in particular Black voucher holders, into their properties where they have neighboring residents who might not approve. And of course, most cities and states don't have adequate legal protections for voucher holders. There is no national law protecting a landlord from discriminating against a voucher holder in the way that race, gender, or religious background are protected classes. So because landlords' motives are really aligned with their own bottom line and not necessarily with the greater good or with the goals of this program, we see this dual trend of predatory inclusion on the one hand and then exclusion on the other hand, both of which really contribute to broader patterns of racial segregation. And due to all this, the lack of legal protections, the persistence of racial discrimination, and the role of landlords, I think it's fair to say that choice among voucher holders really remains largely a fiction. So the potential is there, but it remains unrealized. All of this points to the failure of the market as a system in and of itself, capable of addressing the problem. Now, finally, I'll tell you about one last chapter. One of the ideas used to justify the transition to the voucher program is the idea that neighborhoods matter for life outcomes. So in contrast to public housing, where people had no choice but to live in neighborhoods with few resources, again, policymakers hoped that voucher holders might be able to access new neighborhoods and especially new neighbors, people who might connect them to jobs and other resources. And this is what sociologists, of course, also social capital, the set of tools and information that your social networks can impart to you. And given Park Heights' history as a large homeowning community, we might expect that residents have lots of resources to impart to newcomers with perhaps less of the racial animosity that we would expect in white neighborhoods. But I didn't find this to be the case. Park Heights is a neighborhood that is quite fragile in itself. The homeowners who moved there were victims of predatory housing schemes, redlining, blockbusting, etc. And now they're quite protective of what little they have left, and they perceive voucher holders to be a threat to their home values. What's more, community organizations don't help to bridge this divide. While there are a number of organizations in the neighborhood, improvement associations, healthcare groups, community groups, they tend to serve homeowners and renters separately, which really serves to reify the differences between these groups. So, in conclusion, I lost my last page somewhere, but in conclusion, I think what I'm trying to say in this book is that housing policy is really important. It's something that both has served a role in creating some of the inequalities that we see today, but also has the potential to undo it. And when we look at this housing policy in particular, that's exactly what we see. We see a lot of effort to create a policy that offers choice and opportunity and could be a tool in dismantling patterns of residential racial segregation. But in fact, it doesn't have enough safeguards in it to actually make it any different than what we see in the market more broadly. There are a number of policy suggestions that I think are important. What I say in the book is that despite these really important shortcomings, this is not a situation where I think we should throw out the policy. It's a situation where we need to put in these safeguards to actually help it work better, and in particular to reduce the influence of landlords and sort of empower tenants to have a fuller set of information and a fuller set of choices. So it may sound very damning, some of the things I described, but I actually think that some of the fixes are quite simple. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to go through these policies one by one because I think they're going to come up both in the conversation with Mike and then also in the Q&A more broadly. So if that is not the case, please hold me to it and I'll make sure that I run through these.
Okay. Thank you, Eva. We're all clapping out here somewhere, various locations.
I ended you while I was talking, so hopefully I didn't lose you.
So thank you so much for running through that book. I mean, you know, it of course strikes me as someone who had the pleasure to read the book that the task of consolidating all of that into 20 minutes is so difficult, but you did a wonderful job of giving us you know, really a sense of your work and what you've learned and what what you concluded along the way. And you know, I guess like one thing that I'm sure all of us out there would love to know that is just kind of, what is your personal story about how you came to study housing and poverty and sociology and specifically the housing needs of low-income families?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, I think one of the origin stories for me was being in Chicago in the early 2000s and seeing the last of the Robert Taylor homes standing, and that was something that that really struck me. It was explained to me as, oh, well, we tore down these towers because they weren't healthy for people and they concentrated poverty, and so they're living in better homes and new places, and then many of them are going to come back into this mixed income environment. And of course, when you looked around at the time, and maybe I can share my screen really briefly here to show you this photo. Let's see. So can you see this? On the left, you see all the Robert Taylor homes along State Street, and then you see the beginning of the demolition in the late 90s. And then this is actually a photo from Rob Sampson's Great American City, where there's literally just nothing there. And this is what I saw when I was there. It was really striking to see that while they were claiming to bring all these people back into this better environment, it was 10 years out from the beginning of the demolition, and actually nothing had changed at all. And so that was certainly a motivating moment for me to try to understand how we provide aid for people who need it, housing aid in this country, and what we're doing wrong. And I think I'll repeat something I said at the end of the talk, which is that housing policy, for me as a sociologist, is this really interesting area where it is both responsible, I think. First, it's really a story of a set of policies gone wrong in many ways, some of which was intentional, some of which was unintentional. But it's also really the tool that we have to fix the situation, and there's really a tension there. So I think when I saw that last Robert Taylor home, the last building out of 20 remaining, it sort of struck me as this very visual representation of something that had failed, and I sort of felt very motivated to better understand what it was that had failed and why.
Yeah, I can really identify with that. I mean, you know, I haven't, you know, certainly haven't done field work really anywhere, but not including in Chicago. But I feel like I started my housing teaching and research career talking a lot about like, well, you know, we kind of have to tear down some of this stuff, like look at Chicago. And I believe that that we will make the right choices about bringing people back into these places. And then like a few years go by, you look at somewhere like Robert Taylor homes, you look at, I mean, even places like Cabrini Green, you know, where there's huge contests over like who gets to come back there, right? Or who gets to live there, right? And so it's always so much more complicated, you know, as you kind of go down the road and see what is going to evolve.
Yeah, and I think when you look at some of the redevelopments too, you're missing part of the picture. So even in the situations where the redevelopments look really successful and look like a huge improvement over what was there before, you're sort of missing all the people who didn't come back, and that's sort of an invisible. That's much harder to study, to go out and actually find, well, what happened to the people who didn't come back.
Of course. So you didn't, write a book about Chicago. You wrote a book about Baltimore. Like what, and Baltimore was one of the original or one of the 5 cities in the Moving Opportunity Study. So like it has a particular place in housing research, but I feel like it's just a frequent site of fieldwork and other housing scholarship questions. Like what makes Baltimore so interesting to study?
Yeah, so, and I ended up in Baltimore for the first time because of MTO, because I was working on the qualitative follow-up to MTO, and was really struck in a somewhat different way than I was in Chicago, but by the level of blight and abandonment that I had not seen before. So when I started studying Baltimore, it was my impression, and I may have been completely naive, that no one was studying Baltimore, and that no one had yet, that The Wire was out, but nobody really had watched The Wire. It hadn't actually become popular yet. And so Baltimore struck me as this really interesting city that sort of reminded me of Chicago in a lot of ways, but nobody was really talking about. And also used to be one of the 10 biggest cities in the country, and absolutely isn't anymore, and is barely even remembered for having been that. But it is a city that has a lot of sort of shadows from the past and a lot of infrastructure for a population that no longer really lives there. So in some ways it was an accident, but I think I have learned a lot about Baltimore now that makes it a really important place to study. For one, if you want to study this transition from public housing to vouchers, I think it's one of the best places to do it. I mean, we can think of places like Atlanta or Chicago. These are extreme cases where very large portions of public housing was torn down and transitioned to vouchers. And Baltimore is right up there with those two in terms of proportions of public housing. So as a qualitative researcher, we often look for extreme cases because if we're trying to understand mechanisms, we want to pick a case where it's really happening clearly so that we can understand it and pick it apart. And so Baltimore in that sense is a really good example of that. It's also not accidental. It's one of the sites of one of the big 3 housing desegregation lawsuits in the country. So we usually think of Gautreaux. Some people know about the Walker case in Dallas, but the Thompson case in Baltimore is the other big one, where the ACLU sued HUD for intentionally and unintentionally both, right, segregating public housing during a certain period of time. And the consent decree required the creation of a mobility program. And the mobility program is not what I studied, but because of this legal case, the voucher program, in part because of this legal case, the voucher program, I think, is much bigger in Baltimore than it is in certain other places. And so again, it's sort of a place where the things I'm interested in understanding are happening in a little bit more of an obvious way. There are some other interesting idiosyncrasies about Baltimore, like it is always cited as the place where blockbusting was invented. I'm guessing that's one of those things was invented in multiple places at the same time. And it's certainly not something to be proud of, but it does have, like many cities in this country, an interesting history of really obvious private and public mechanisms for racial exclusion and racial segregation.
Yeah. And, I imagine, some of our attendees might be too young to have watched The Wire, straight through like many of us. So if you're really curious about Baltimore, one way, in this time of needing something to watch on HBO or Netflix, go for The Wire. So, there's lots of policy discussions, of course, that are relevant here that your book brings up that we're engaged in, to the extent that the federal government pays a lot of attention to how to change the voucher program. And you mentioned some at the end there, issues of source of income laws, small area fair market rents, time limits for vouchers, and I think a lot of what some of the Democratic politicians in particular have been talking about is, making a universal voucher, right? So,
Yeah.
I think you might have touched on this, but not everybody who qualifies for a voucher by income gets one, right? You talked about long waiting lists, no matter where you are in this country, that's pretty much the norm. Just taking a couple of those policies, like how do you think some of these changes might affect what you saw in Baltimore, right? Like, or in Park Heights, how might some of these things play out?
So when it comes to universal vouchers, and that's probably the policy change that will be most difficult to achieve, although it's something that Biden has talked about in his housing plan that he released in July. So it's something that's certainly on the table in a way that it hasn't been, depending on what happens in the fall. But so I think when we think about expanding vouchers to everyone who needs them, the biggest advantage that I can see there is the fact that it would really diminish the stigma that voucher holders face. And I think with all of these smaller fixes, some of them are very hard to implement and enforce. And stigma is the thing that prevents people from getting to the neighborhoods that they actually want to go to. So in the book, I talk about one of the women who I got to know. Her name was Edie. She was on the voucher waiting list for, I think, 8 years. It had always been her dream to move out to the county, to Owens Mills. She had visited many times. She was very excited to go there. She finally gets the voucher, which is basically like winning the lottery. And she goes out and she tries to use it in the county, and she's just turned down over and over because at the time there was no law that required landlords to accept her voucher. And they didn't want to voucher hold it. They had sort of, I can only guess in Edie's case, but I have actually studied the other side of this from the landlord perspective. And they tend to have all sorts of stereotypes and ideas about who voucher holders are and what kind of care they'll take of the place or not, and how many kids they might have. And so I think it being a program that landlords are more familiar with would actually make a huge difference. And my research on the landlord side of this, which is only in the book in a small bit, really shows that when landlords are exposed to the program, they tend to have positive experiences with it, especially on the tenant side, and they tend to really appreciate the reliable rent and really appreciate the tenants. So I actually think that would make a huge difference. But whether or not we expand it to everyone who needs it, and in fact, especially if we expand it to everyone who needs it, I think that some of these smaller fixes are really, really key, because ramping up the program in its current form would sort of exacerbate some of these inequalities that I'm talking about. So if you don't fix this problem where we're overpaying landlords in poor neighborhoods and underpaying them in wealthier neighborhoods, then you're going to see the same sort of flow of people to the more disadvantaged neighborhoods, and that's just going to make that whole gradient worse. And so small area FMR, setting payment standards at a more local level, not at the level of the entire metropolitan region, but at, say, the zip code level or the neighborhood level, would really help to eliminate that premium and allow people more money to be more competitive in neighborhoods that are higher cost neighborhoods. And it doesn't do anything to curb their choices. They can still live in whatever neighborhoods they want, but they have more money to do it in the neighborhoods that cost more. And then source of income discrimination protection, which many of you may know about, is not a federal law. Baltimore, Maryland has since actually passed source of income discrimination, and of course, but a lot of places don't have it. Of course, the big problem with source of income protection is that it's very hard to enforce. The research suggests that it works to some degree, but I think paired with small area FMR, it could actually be very strong. So if you pair a sort of a stick with a carrot, right, it may actually be much more effective.
Right. Yeah, and we only scratched the surface on some of the kind of potential federal changes here, but our recent national discourse, of course, on housing, in my view, I think makes so much of this so much more challenging, right? Where I think the scholarship has been pretty strong on the extent to which the mobility of lower income families into higher income or higher opportunity neighborhoods does not, demonstrably affect in a negative way those neighborhoods, right, that receive them or that where they choose to live. And that's obviously the opposite of our public discourse right now, at least in some circles. I'm not going to name names. So, I think that's an added challenge and an added way in which, we can see, as you put it, kind of our housing policies, which have the potential of moving, of making things more equal, reducing equity in other ways if we kind of, follow that discourse. So I want to make sure that I give the audience some opportunities to ask questions. We've got a bunch of wonderful questions that I'm gonna start firing off here. Beginning with a question on how much we spend as a country on vouchers in the United States. And there's also a question of kind of the distribution, whether it's mostly in large cities or if there's a federal or local state share. I know some of this, but I'll let you go first.
Yeah, and Mike, I'll just let you know, I can't see those questions, so right. I only know what you tell me.
I have the power.
Yeah, exactly. So vouchers are mostly funded federally, but they are implemented locally, and they are sometimes supplemented with local funds. So like DC has, where I live, has an additional local program that funds an additional number of vouchers. I don't have the budget off of the top of my head on how much.
I think it's around 20 billion. We serve something like 2 million plus, 2.5 million families.
And I know the estimates for a universal program are like 40 to 60 billion, which is quite a bit more than we spend currently, but not on an order of, not in an insane way. The question was how much.
Yeah, I think you did. I think you did, address it. And I mean, I think another way of thinking about the budget is, if you're worried, do we spend too much, do we spend too little, is comparing our spending on low-income rental subsidies of various types, public housing, tax credits, vouchers, to what we spend on home ownership subsidies, right, through tax breaks, mostly the mortgage interest deduction, and those. We spend so much more, orders of magnitude more on, subsidizing my home, which you're getting to look in my office here, than on a low-income renter's family, right?
Absolutely. And the other, I think, piece of this is to think about what kinds of money we spend on other sorts of housing programs that aren't housing subsidies. So when we think about problems that have gotten a lot of attention in recent years, especially like eviction and homelessness, we do spend a certain amount on trying to remedy problems related to housing once people have already lost their housing.
Yeah.
And like healthcare, maybe is a good analogy, that tends to be a fairly costly way to address the problem. It's absolutely necessary, and we should be helping people in these emergency situations, but it tends to be very costly to rehouse people at that point. And there's certainly an argument to be made for expanding, is sort of think of it as preventative care, right? Expanding housing subsidies to people before they lose their homes to actually prevent them from losing their homes in the first place. And of course, if you then think about all of the related externalities that occur when someone does lose their housing, related to their job, related to their health, related to their children's stability in school, right? These are all sorts of extra costs that perhaps if we had just provided housing in the first place, we might be spending actually a lot less on all these other things.
Yeah, and speaking from Los Angeles and California more generally, I mean, that's the enormous hole and humanitarian disaster and crisis that we're speaking from. Next question is from Madeline Hamlin. Does public housing, do public housing and vouchers serve a different population, or are they similar? Or kind of what are the different roles that they play?
Yeah, so I think so vouchers tend to reach a somewhat higher income bracket than public housing, although there's a ton of overlap. And I think this is the other point when we think about expanding housing vouchers, is that we maybe shouldn't expect housing vouchers to be able to be the solution for everyone. I think there are households for whom public housing is a better option, and that doesn't mean it needs to be public housing like the pictures I showed you of public housing in the mid-century. There's public housing all over the world that is safe and clean and doesn't cause some of the problems that we've seen in this country, but it does provide families that have additional needs, families that are very large or may have members of the household with disabilities who aren't necessarily prepared to go out and find a home in the private market. And so I think that public housing can be a really important tool for certain households. It's not something we need to do away with entirely. They serve overlapping but somewhat different populations.
Right. And next question is from Lori Jacobs, and I'm glad she asked this because you're one of the leading experts on landlords. Landlords must meet requirements to be included in the voucher program. Do these requirements end up creating a barrier to participation, and what could be done about those barriers?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest official requirement is really for a landlord to pass a yearly inspection. And that part is super important. And it's part of the reason why, in general, although not in every case, but in general, units rented through the Housing Voucher Program tend to be in better condition than some of the units you might see. For example, some of the units that I saw in Park Heights that weren't subsidized that could not have passed a housing inspection. That being said, there does come a point where you might argue that those inspections are too onerous, and some people have suggested that maybe for landlords who repeatedly always pass their inspections, maybe we could develop sort of a fast track for those landlords. But aside from requirements, I do think there's a really important point in this question, which is that participating in the Housing Voucher Program as a landlord requires a lot of bureaucratic red tape. It's a slower process. It requires approval from the housing authority. There's this sort of back and forth between the housing authority, the tenant, and the landlord. Sometimes the housing authority is very delayed in getting that first payment set up. And so once you're set up, everything runs pretty reliably and smoothly from the landlord's perspective. Getting set up can take additional time. And that's exactly why for many landlords who have an alternative, who can rent to a market rate renter who they have confidence will be able to pay their rent on time, many of those landlords will turn to that alternative market renter. And so eliminating some of this bureaucratic red tape, I think, is really, really essential if we want to ramp the program up and expect that it will actually work and that landlords will participate. Because the other piece of this, of course, is that it's not that hard for landlords to find a way to just fail the inspection and then not have to rent to the voucher tenant, or raise the rent just over the payment standard so that it no longer qualifies for the program, for example. So we need to make it easier for landlords to participate if we want them to do so on a large scale.
Right. And so that, that's more of the carrot. You talked about carrots and sticks, and you talked a little bit about the source of income laws. So Jacob Wasserman asks about these laws in particular. What do we know from the research literature about how effective these source of income laws are, where you can't discriminate against people on the basis of having a voucher to pay the rent?
Yeah, so there's a number of papers by Lance Freeman and a few of his colleagues and a HUD report that really look carefully at where these laws were rolled out and when and what kind of an effect they have. And they have a significant but not huge effect. So I think it's one of these things where it's a tool in the toolbox. It's not going to solve this problem on its own, but it's not something we should ignore either. And I think, sometimes people read those papers and they say, oh, this doesn't help much. And other people read it and they say, this is huge. And so, it's one of those effects, like most public policy, really, where it has an effect. It's real, but it's not gonna do everything on its own. And so we need to remove some of those barriers, as well as, I think, making these requirements and making the enforcement a lot stiffer.
Right, right. And we have thousands of housing authorities across the country. I can't remember the exact count, but it's a very large number. And
500.
500?
Over 2,500.
Over 2,500. Oh, good. Yes. In my mind, I was like 2,000 something, yeah. So I said thousands. So, a question from Alex Balcazar is what local housing authorities can and other local officials can do to make the voucher program more fair, just, and effective? Or is this mainly a federal issue? Like, are we, is this something that Congress needs to fix?
Yeah, it's really both. I mean, there's really this tension because officially, and especially from the local housing authority perspective, their job, for most of them, unless they're running a mobility program, which are usually separate, they see their job, and I've talked to a lot of public housing authorities, they see their job as to provide housing for people, to give subsidies, to keep roofs over people's heads. They don't see their job as getting people to any particular type of neighborhood or offering any particular set of choices, which isn't to criticize them. That is technically their job. And I think for many of them too, they know exactly what their budget is, and they know that for every voucher they offer, the higher in a monetary value that voucher is, the fewer number of households they'll actually be able to help. So there's this direct trade-off really between mobility, the mobility goals, which require vouchers of higher cost, and just getting as many people housed as possible. And so they're dealing with, a very needy population. They're doing their best to get homes for these people. But it turns out that in many cases, they're doing this very inefficiently, and that shouldn't be surprising if any of you have ever tried to do anything with local government. It's not always the most efficient. So I think it's both a local problem and a federal problem. I think it's something that is clearly happening at the local level, but may not be solved without some resources and some push from the federal government, in particular more money, but also more information about what kinds of changes would actually lower the barrier to entry for landlords, and what kinds of changes would make it easier for tenants to sign up for the waiting list, and find out where they are on the waiting list. And some of this is technology. Some of this is updating computer systems so that we can actually spend time dispersing housing subsidies and not just finding people on the waiting list.
Right. And I mean, some of this are unresolved tensions, right? Between, fair housing, getting, or neighborhood opportunity points of emphasis, right? Getting people into particular places, into neighborhoods that we think are safe and healthy and all that sort of, have good schools. And some of this is, like you said, the housing authority mindset most of the time. Let's just spend this money on this family, get them housed however we can. And to some extent, this next question, it's an anonymous question, it gets at this a little bit, which is that different cities have very different demographics and housing markets, right? Baltimore has a lot of surplus land and housing. You showed us, more vacant housing than we are accustomed to seeing in most of Los Angeles these days, for better or for worse. So LA doesn't have much of that, right? Like, so how do you think, I think one way to interpret this question is like, how does a tight housing market look different in terms of what you might have seen in Fieldwork
versus
a place like Baltimore, specifically a place like Park Heights?
Yeah, and I mean, again, this is actually one of the reasons why it both makes sense to study Baltimore, and also it's really important to contextualize how Baltimore is different. And that is that for landlords who don't have a lot of other options, they don't have a lot of market rate renters who they're confident can pay their rent on time, the voucher program makes a ton of sense, because that rent ceiling is set at a metropolitan level. It's going to be more than they can get from any typical tenant in their neighborhood, and it's going to actually come every month. But in places where there are other alternatives, that sort of decision calculus really changes, right? Again, when you have someone who you think can pay that rent, when you have a tight housing market and there's a line of people out the door who want your home, renting to a voucher holder is less attractive. And so this is where we really need to fine tune the incentives as far as how much money we're offering for vouchers. And we need to emphasize some of the value of the program, which even in places where landlords aren't getting more, and arguably they shouldn't be getting more than market rent, they are getting rent reliably. And I think particularly in a national crisis like the one we're in, what we've seen landlords report in the last couple of months is that, contrary to our fears, the voucher program is more and more attractive, because it means they're not wondering whether or not their tenants will be able to pay their rent. And so emphasizing some of the reliability of the program, I think is really is part of the sell. But
Yeah.
certainly, yes, you're going to see really big differences in tighter housing markets.
Absolutely. So we got like 30 seconds left. You know, do you want, are there any closing thoughts or something that we didn't ask you that you want to touch
on? I think I'll just say that I'll just sort of remind you guys of this tension where sometimes we forget, in criticizing the very real problems with the program, we forget some of the basic ways in which it really meets people's housing needs, and at the very least keeps them sheltered, which in these times is so important. And that we sometimes overfocus on the choice aspect. But that being said, I think it doesn't mean we can't implement some of these fixes that would really allow people to make more fuller choices, and to be less subject to the influence of landlords, and to actually make decisions for themselves in a more real way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's a wonderful place to wrap up. I really thank you so much, Eva, and again, everybody around the country is clapping for you. And thank you to everybody out there who's listening to this. And you know, I believe we'll be able to post the video of this. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to use this in one of my classes. I think this will be pretty perfect. And you know, I really enjoyed the opportunity to read the book, and it's wonderful to reconnect with you over this strange little medium that we have.
It's great to be here, honestly. Thank you so much, Mike.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.